African American schools towards the end of the Civil War and during Reconstruction contained suffering at every level. Whether it was a lack of funding, the students and teachers fighting poverty, or violent threats towards the schools. The combination of these struggles made building schools for the newly freed slaves more challenging than originally expected. But despite these struggles, African Americans remained determined to attend school. They were free now and could finally receive the education they so long had been denied. Teacher Laura Town in the Sea Islands of South Carolina stated, "Their steady eagerness to learn is just something amazing. To be deprived of a lesson is a severe punishment." African Americans had many reasons for wishing to receive an education. Many wanted to read the Bible, others hoped to protect themselves against carpetbaggers or their former masters, and some believed hard work in school stood as their best opportunity to find economic and political success. Education provided the best step towards helping them find their place in this new world. Unfortunately, white supremacy constantly limited their opportunities. The first major obstacle black schools in the South faced was funding. These schools received the majority of their funding from the Freedmen's Bureau, Northern Charities, Northern Missionary Societies, and donations from the local communities. In the poorest regions, parents were forced to build their own schools, buy their own textbooks, and feed, board, and protect the teachers. This lack of funding forced many schools to close their doors. Booker T. Washington describes that some of the early schoolhouses consisted of 4 pieces of timber driven into the ground and a brush spread overhead as a covering to keep out the sun and rain. Freedmen's Bureau provided the largest portion of funding to black schools. According to historian Ronald Butchart, they rented buildings for schoolrooms, provided books and transportation for teachers, superintended the schools, and offered military protection for students and teachers against the opponents of black literacy. Unfortunately, though, they could never meet the high demands of the black community. A shortage of schools led to children having no school available to them, or extremely large class sizes, especially in the cities. Esther Douglas, a teacher in Savannah, Georgia, in 1865, had a 16 by 17 room, sometimes packed with 90 or more students. Douglas explained her students as 120 dirty, half-naked, perfectly wild black children crowded on the floor. After the Freedmen's Bureau closed in 1870, states took over public schools in the South and provided minimal funding to black schools. Some local districts even refused to fund public secondary education for black students. Poverty also played an obstacle for these schools, as most of the black students lived in poverty. Teacher Mary Ames wrote in her diary that poverty placed such a burden on the students that it was difficult for many to survive, let alone go to school. Teacher Laura Town describes in her letters that her students had little food and all wore old clothes. Absentees were normal during the school year, especially in the winter, when illness spread fast, students lacked warm clothes or shoes, and drafty schools did not provide enough protection from the elements. Memories of slavery also placed another burden on the children. Historian Jacqueline Jones describes, "Slavery had left its mark on the children and conditioned their responses to white authority figures. The pupils deeply feared physical punishment." Ames wrote that many of her students wore scars from when they had been whipped as slaves. But despite these disadvantages, students still wished to educate themselves. Teachers of Southern black schools faced many hardships too. Northern teachers coming to the South did not receive warm welcomes. Ames wrote in her diary, the community members looked at her with disgust or just ignored her. And upon arrival, she was forced to sleep on the floorboard since no accommodations were made for her. Many teachers lived in poverty, with black teachers facing the worst. Some white communities refused housing to the homeless teachers. Other communities went as far as banning teachers of African American schools in certain areas of town. There are exceptions, though. Northern teachers of the American Missionary Association lived better lives in the cities where they had cooks and comfortable homes. The rural areas are where teachers faced the most hardships of poverty and harassment. But whether from the North or South, all teachers seem to have faced some type of opposition. The largest opposition schools faced, though, stood as threats from white members of the community who opposed black education. Some white Southerners refused to employ black parents who had children that attended schools. There are also numerous incidents of violence towards teachers, students, and schoolhouses. In North Carolina, an incident occurred where a white man tried to kill a Northern teacher by setting a savage dog on her. Alfred Morris closed his school in North Carolina only after 6 weeks due to, as he quoted, his apprehensive to his safety. Between the 1860s and 1870s, hundreds of black schoolhouses were destroyed and burned to the ground. Riots in Memphis in 1865 and New Orleans in 1866 destroyed many schools, churches, and homes. Some early historians claim teachers brought this violence upon themselves, but history proves otherwise. Southern white resistance was fueled by white supremacy. This terrorism on black education had been occurring for a long time, but gained strength with the significant rise of black education throughout Reconstruction. Many Southern whites opposed African American schools because they believed the schools threatened white supremacy and that the teachers threatened Southern customs and traditions. These attacks were not an assault on education. They were an attack on black freedom. The South lost the war, but they refused to lose the battle against white supremacy. The Civil War did not prove to be the end of the civil rights issue in America. It only marked the beginning. It would take another 80 years to legally end segregation and provide equal opportunities in education. But every struggle has a beginning, and it's the people like these teachers and the African American students that fought for change who make a difference and influence the future.